Welcome back to Stratagames. We are upgrading the Preconstructed Adventures in the Forgotten Realms commander decks, and today we're talking about Sefris of the Hidden Ways, who costs white, blue, black for a 2/3 with, whenever one or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, venture into the dungeon. This ability triggers only once each turn. And, whenever you complete a dungeon, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this guy wants you to be putting creatures into your graveyard left and right, complete a quick dungeon, and reanimate something huge. Now, since his venture ability only triggers once each turn, we want to look for ways to ensure that we can trigger it on every player's turn, which will allow us to complete a dungeon every turn cycle. Then we want to include some good reanimation targets, and we'll be good to go. Let's start by looking at what comes in the deck and deciding which cards we don't want. Then we can find some good replacements. First, the deck includes several ways to filter your draws. Looting is an excellent way to put creatures in your graveyard, because you get to pick exactly what you want to discard, allowing you to set up your reanimation targets. However, Murder of Crows is hard to trigger exactly when you want it to, and Forbidden Alchemy and Vanish into Memory... Well, in this deck we are highly prioritizing creatures, because the more creatures we have, the easier it is to discard one every turn to keep advancing our dungeon. So while we are willing to play down creature spells, it's a high bar to clear, and these two don't quite make it. Next up we have the bulk of the creatures. Many of these have enters the battlefield effects, which you can use and then throw away the creature just to reanimate it again to get more value. The ones I'm less impressed with are Clay Golem, for being too expensive in a deck with so many other removal options, Ronam Unicorn, for doing just a little too little, and Phantasmal Image, because while it's a good card, you want to focus more on reanimating things that are powerful on their own, and I feel it's too inconsistent. Now, you're not always going to be able to reanimate with Sefris when it's convenient. Maybe you're still several steps away from completing a dungeon, or he just keeps getting killed. For this situation, you want some cards that can reanimate without him. The deck comes with several. Sun Titan's power cannot be understated. I have been hard-pressed to find a white deck that I don't want him in, and his restriction is well worth making sure you have a lot of small stuff to bring back. Karmic Guide and Doomed Necromancer bring back any creature while killing themselves, which can trigger Sefris, and Victimize and Unburial Rites are so good they're worth keeping even though they aren't creatures. The only cuts here are Revivify and Grave Endeavor because they're too inconsistent. Most of this deck's removal spells are creatures we already showed, but there is also a solid suite of instant removal. In addition, Necrotic Sliver, while feeling like a weird inclusion, is pretty solid because it deals with any permanent, puts itself into the graveyard to trigger Sefris, and can be brought back repeatedly with Sun Titan. The not-so-good cards are Minimus Containment, which also deals with anything, but it's a vulnerable enchantment rather than a synergistic creature. Immovable Rod, which is too expensive and conditional to function as a good dungeon enabler, and Necromantic Selection, which is just an inefficient way to board wipe or to reanimate when we can get those effects on creatures. For ramp, we have several perennial picks. There's also Dungeon Map, which is a nice way to help you advance your dungeons, and Eternal Dragon and Burnished Heart, who tutor up lands while putting themselves into your graveyard for Sefris. Component Pouch and Bucknard's Everfull Purse are being cut because they're, you guessed it, too inconsistent to be good. I really like the idea of dice rolling in a deck that cares about that sort of thing, but not when my cards being good is contingent on rolling well. Now, Sefris is capable of completing dungeons all on his own. You don't need to include any other venture into the dungeon cards, but this deck comes with a few good ones. Midnight Pathlighter makes your creatures mostly unblockable and ventures when you hit. Radiant Solar ventures whenever you get a non-token creature, and can put herself into the graveyard to be reanimated. Thorough Investigation lets you swing in with your now worthless ETB creatures, and who cares if they die, you got card advantage. And Hamapashar doubles all your dungeon room triggers. Really good stuff here, I'm not cutting these. And as always, there are several cards that don't fit in with the specific theme of this deck, and who really want you to focus on things we're not doing. On a special note, Min, Wily Illusionist, is almost really good in this deck, giving you a bunch of high-power creatures that will die to trigger Sefris, and when they do, you can play one of your massive creatures from hand for free. Unfortunately, Sefris specifies that only creature cards will trigger his first ability, and while tokens do hit the graveyard briefly when they die, they do not count as cards and do not trigger Sefris. That's why we're focusing more on discard than on making a bunch of tokens to sacrifice. Sorry, Min. The miscellaneous cards I do like are Lightning Greaves, because, well, Lightning Greaves. Propaganda, because it helps you survive to the point where you're reanimating massive creatures every turn. And Phantom Steed, because it lets you protect a creature and or reuse your ETB effects again and again. So this gives us 19 card slots to work with. First, I want more reanimation targets. There just aren't enough. Shieldred keeps your opponent's creatures in check and lets you bring back even more of your own. Revelark lets you reanimate small creatures, including your commander. And Agent of Treachery steals any permanent. Beyond these generically powerful targets, we also want Chromium, Prognostic Sphinx, Dream Trawler, and Doom Whisperer, most of whom can protect themselves, and all of whom can easily put cards into your graveyard whenever you want, allowing you to complete a dungeon every turn cycle. Of course, we need more ways of getting these guys into the graveyard in the first place. Wharf Infiltrator, Ghostly Pilferer, and Master of Death are all good card advantage engines that can come out early and fill your graveyard fuller than Bob Saget's house. Sidisi Undead Vizier lets you tutor while killing itself or one of your ETB creatures. Dimir Houseguard can do the same, or serves as a free sack outlet to keep advancing your dungeon. Yawgmoth can sacrifice or discard while accruing limitless value. And Sir Conrad is an excellent win condition in any deck that even glances at its graveyard, and it can mill more creatures. Both Corpse Connoisseur and Gravebreaker Lamia tutor creatures directly to your graveyard, and have enters the battlefield effects to abuse. Apprentice Necromancer and Priest of Fell Rites give you a couple more cheap reanimation effects. And finally, Tortured Existence lets you trigger Sefris for just 1 mana every turn, and sculpt your hand and graveyard. For lands, I'd like to add Phyrexian Tower for another sacrifice outlet, and Dungeon Descent for another Venture Mana Sink. Now if you're like me, you can cut a couple basics, and if you're disciplined, I don't know, like Exotic Orchard and Choked Estuary. I really like the way this commander works, and I had a lot of fun upgrading the deck. You can find a link to my deck list in the description. I hope this video has been helpful to you. If so, you can help me by remembering to like, subscribe, ring the bell, and let me know in the comments how you would change this deck. Sir Comrade